black teacher was fired for not fitting in. Years later, the white principal begged for her help. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows of Roosevelt High, painting long golden rectangles across the hallway floors. It was the end of the school year, that strange, liminal period when the air is thick with both exhaustion and possibility. Students dreaming of summer freedom, teachers counting the days until they could breathe again. Yet for Monica Harris, the familiar hum of lockers slamming and voices echoing down the halls felt heavier than usual, as though the building itself were bracing to deliver news she did not want to hear. Monica had been at Roosevelt High for nearly 7 years, teaching history with the kind of passion that could coax even the most disinterested sophomore into imagining the dusty streets of ancient cities or the tense smoke-filled rooms where nations were born. She had built a reputation not just for her deep knowledge, but for the way she treated her students, like human beings whose potential mattered, regardless of the grades in their last report card or the trouble they'd gotten into the week before. Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at her for months. It wasn't about the students. They were her anchor. It was the subtle shifts in how the administration spoke to her, the clipped meetings, the little comments that always came wrapped in a smile. That afternoon, she was called into the principal's office. Alan Whitmore sat behind his desk, the blinds drawn, a manila folder resting in front of him. He was in his early 50s, with the kind of tan that suggested weekends on the golf course, and a crispness in his shirts that spoke of a life ironed smooth by habit and predictability. "Monica," he began, leaning back in his chair as though the physical distance could soften what was coming. "I'll just get straight to it. We've decided not to renew your contract for next year." She blinked, the words landing with a dull weight. "Not renew? I'm sorry, Alan. I wasn't aware there were any concerns with my performance." He clasped his hands, fingers interlaced in that practiced way administrators use when they want to appear measured. "It's not about performance per se. You're a good teacher. No one's denying that. But there's a question of fit. We've been moving in a different direction as a school, trying to create a certain culture. And well," Monica's voice sharpened, though she kept it low. "And I don't fit into that culture?" Alan gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. "Sometimes it's just about chemistry. You know how it is. This decision wasn't easy, but I think it's best for everyone." She sat there for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken truths. Not a good fit. She'd heard the phrase before, the kind that sounded benign but always seemed to be deployed when someone couldn't quite say the real thing aloud. Finally, she stood. "I see. Well, thank you for letting me know." Alan offered a hand across the desk, but she simply nodded and turned toward the door, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and something darker, the quiet knowledge that this was less about her ability and more about the way she had refused to smooth out her edges to match the mold the school preferred. In the weeks that followed, she packed up her classroom slowly, each poster and book and stack of graded papers a reminder of the years she had poured into this place. Students stopped by to ask why she was leaving, and she gave them the same half answer every time. Sometimes life sends you in a new direction. She didn't tell them that the direction wasn't hers to choose. Summer came, and with it, the uncertain expanse of time ahead. She took on a few tutoring jobs, then a short-term contract at a community center, and before long, her days were full again, not with the same rhythms as teaching high school, but with something that felt freer, less bound by the politics of faculty meetings and administrative whispers. Years passed. Monica built a small but thriving educational consulting practice, helping underfunded schools design history curriculums that actually engaged students instead of lulling them into textbook-induced boredom. She worked in districts where the walls were cracked and the budgets thinner than the paper the textbooks were printed on, yet she found a satisfaction she had never quite managed to feel at Roosevelt. And then, one bright morning in early autumn, her phone rang. The number was familiar, though she hadn't seen it in years. "Monica," came the voice on the other end, slightly thinner, more tentative than she remembered. "It's Alan Whitmore, from Roosevelt." She froze, her pen hovering above her notebook. "Alan, I know it's been a long time," he said, a pause stretching out just enough to suggest he was weighing his words. "I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important. We need your help." Monica leaned back in her chair, a slow, measured smile forming despite herself. The voice that had once told her she didn't fit now carried something she had never heard from him before. It sounded a lot like desperation. Monica let the silence hang between them for a moment longer than politeness required. She wanted him to feel it. The weight of the years since they had last spoken, the echo of that last conversation in his office, the unspoken wound of being told she didn't belong. Alan finally broke it. "I understand if you're surprised to hear from me. I'd imagine I'm the last person you expected to call." "You could say that," Monica replied, her tone carefully balanced between cordial and cool. "So, you need my help. That's a phrase I never thought I'd hear from you." On the other end, she could hear him inhale slowly, the faint rasp of breath like someone who had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his head, but was now finding the real thing harder to manage. "It's complicated. Roosevelt's going through some serious challenges. We've had staff turnover, enrollment declines, funding cuts, and on top of that, there's a serious gap in the history department. We've tried to bring in new talent, but you keep losing them," Monica finished, not as a question, but as a certainty. "Yes," he admitted, his voice softening. "The students, they're restless. We've had incidents. Parents are on edge. It's not the school I used to run. Frankly, I'm worried about losing more than just test scores." She considered this for a moment. She knew how quickly a school's climate could unravel, how morale, trust, and a sense of safety could erode when the leadership lost its grip on what really mattered. But she also knew this was the same man who had decided, years ago, that she didn't fit in the culture he was building. "Alan," she said slowly, "you'll have to forgive me for pointing out the obvious, but when you let me go, it wasn't because there wasn't work to be done. It was because I didn't match the image you had in mind for Roosevelt." There was a pause, then a low sigh. "I know, and I'll be honest with you. That decision is something I've thought about more than I care to admit. I can't change the past, but I can try to fix the present. You've made a name for yourself since then. People talk about the programs you've built in other districts. I've seen the impact. We need that here." The words were almost flattering, but she heard the strain beneath them. This wasn't just professional outreach. This was an appeal from a man who had run out of options. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "I want you to come in as a consultant," he said. "Help us stabilize the history department, mentor the staff we have left, and work with our most challenging students. You have a way of connecting with kids who have given up on the system. Right now, that's what we're missing." Monica looked out her office window at the street below, watching people cross against the light, heads down against the brisk wind. She thought about the years she'd spent at Roosevelt, the faces of the students she'd fought for, and the way it had ended. She could feel the pull, not toward the administration, but toward the students who were still there, still navigating the same halls where she had once stood. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I can ask," Alan replied, though she could hear the relief in his voice. "If you decide to help, I'll make sure you have the freedom to do what you think is best. No micromanaging, no politics, just results." She almost laughed at that, remembering the endless red tape of the old Roosevelt. "We'll see," she said, and ended the call before he could try to say anything else. That night, Monica sat at her kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling beside her, and pulled out an old notebook she hadn't touched in years. It was the one she had kept during her final year at Roosevelt, filled with lesson plans, reflections, and the occasional frustrated scribble about meetings that had gone nowhere. She flipped through it slowly, the names of former students leaping off the page. So many of them had fought battles bigger than grades and essays. Some had won, some had disappeared from the system entirely. She wondered how many of those stories might have ended differently if she had been allowed to stay. By the time she closed the notebook, her decision was not yet final, but the thought had taken root. She knew one thing for certain. If she went back, she would not be walking in as the teacher who had once been told she didn't belong. She would be coming in on her own terms, with her own conditions. And this time, the principal would not be the one holding all the power. The morning she returned to Roosevelt High, the city was still wrapped in the dull silver of an early autumn overcast, the kind that made the air damp and heavy but sharpened the smell of wet pavement. Monica parked across the street from the brick facade she knew too well, its once bright red trim now dulled and chipped. The building itself seemed tired, not ruined, but worn in the way a place gets when too many people have stopped caring. She sat in her car for a moment, letting her eyes move over the entrance, the broad steps, the banners sagging above the double doors. A memory flickered unbidden. Her first day here all those years ago, the same steps buzzing with students, her hands full of folders and her heart full of purpose. She had been younger then, though not by much, but so much more willing to bend herself to fit into a mold she didn't quite believe in. Now she wasn't here to fit in. She was here to change things, or not at all. Alan was waiting in the front office when she stepped inside, the linoleum floor still polished to a high sheen that couldn't disguise the cracks beneath. His smile was wide but cautious, the look of a man greeting someone whose forgiveness he wasn't sure he'd earned. "Monica," he said, stepping forward, extending his hand like they were old colleagues instead of former adversaries. "It's good to see you." She shook his hand briefly. "Let's keep this professional, Alan. I'm here to work." "Of course," he said quickly, gesturing for her to follow. "I want to give you a quick tour, show you where things stand." As they walked the halls, Monica noticed how different the energy felt. In her day, even on difficult mornings, there had been chatter, laughter, the occasional chaos of young voices bouncing off the cinderblock walls. Now, the corridors felt muted, the sound dampened not just by the acoustics, but by something heavier, a sense of disengagement. Students leaned against lockers in small, tight groups, speaking in low tones, eyes flicking toward her and then away. When they reached the history department, the differences were even starker. Two of the classrooms stood empty, their doors locked, the schedules taped to them outdated by months. "Vacancies," Alan said quietly, as though afraid the walls might hear. "We've been trying to fill them since spring." The teachers who remained looked tired, their faces marked by the kind of exhaustion that went beyond long hours, the exhaustion of fighting battles they no longer believed they could win. Monica exchanged polite nods with them, but she caught in their eyes the question they didn't voice. "What makes you think you can fix this?" Alan led her to a small office they had cleared for her use. The desk was bare except for a stack of folders. "These are the profiles of the students I'm most worried about," he explained. "Kids who are struggling academically, socially, some with behavioral issues. I thought you'd want to start there." She glanced at the top folder and saw a name she recognized instantly, a younger brother of one of her former students. A ripple of memory moved through her, not unpleasant but heavy. "I'll need full access to their records," she said, "and I want to meet them outside of the regular classroom environment first. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to build trust before anything else." Alan nodded. "Whatever you need." As he left her alone, Monica opened the first file, scanning the neat but impersonal notes, grades, incidents, attendance. But she knew these details were only a shadow of the truth. She would have to find the real stories herself. She leaned back in the chair, letting her gaze drift toward the window that overlooked the small courtyard. The trees there were shedding their first leaves, the wind sending them skittering across the cracked pavement. She thought of how much could change in a season, and how much could be rebuilt if the roots were still strong. By the end of her first hour, she knew two things. First, this was going to be harder than anything she'd done before. Second, she was exactly where she needed to be. Monica's first meeting with the students on Alan's most at-risk list was not in a classroom, but in the school library, a place that had once been a bustling hub of activity, but now felt like a forgotten annex. The tall windows let in pale light that cast long stripes across the worn carpet, and the faint smell of old paper lingered in the air. She'd chosen the library deliberately, neutral ground, away from the authority-laden setting of desks in straight rows and the teacher's chair at the front. They shuffled in slowly, some alone, others in pairs, their steps dragging just enough to let her know they weren't here by choice. She noticed right away the guarded expressions, the practiced indifference, the way a few of them avoided making eye contact altogether. They dropped into chairs around the long table without speaking, their body language broadcasting a single message: "We don't trust you." Monica waited until the last one had sat down before she spoke, her voice calm but clear. "I'm not here to lecture you. I'm not here to tell you what you've been doing wrong. I'm here because I want to understand what's going on in your world, not the one on paper, but the one you actually live in." A boy in a red hoodie leaned back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest. "So, what's the catch? We tell you our world, you tell the principal, and we get in more trouble?" "No," she said evenly. "What you say here stays here, unless you tell me something that means you or someone else is in danger. Other than that, it doesn't go beyond this table." A girl with tightly coiled braids narrowed her eyes. "Why should we believe you? Teachers always say that, and then they go running to the office." Monica leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table. "Because I've been where you are. Not in every way, but enough to know how easy it is for people to assume they know you when they've never actually listened to you. And because I'm not here as your teacher. I'm here as someone who wants to help you figure out how to get through this place without losing yourself." That last line seemed to land. A few pairs of eyes flicked toward her, curiosity breaking through the wall of apathy. They talked, haltingly at first, then with more openness as the minutes passed. They told her about teachers who didn't seem to care, about feeling invisible in crowded classrooms, about getting labeled as trouble before they'd even done anything wrong. They spoke of the pressure at home, the jobs they worked after school, the constant sense that the system wasn't built for them. Monica listened without interrupting, scribbling notes not as a record to file, but as reminders of what mattered most to each of them. She asked questions, not the kind that sounded like a survey, but ones that drew out their real voices. By the end of the hour, no one was smiling exactly, but the stiffness in their shoulders had eased. As they gathered their things, the boy in the red hoodie paused at the door. "So, we're doing this again?" he asked, his tone still skeptical but lighter. "If you want to," Monica said. "Same time next week." When they left, the library felt a little less heavy, as though something invisible had shifted. She knew this was only the first step. Trust didn't come in a single meeting, but it was a start. Later that afternoon, Alan found her in her office. "I heard you met with the students," he said. "How did it go?" Monica met his gaze. "They're smart. They see more than you think. But they've been let down enough times to know that words don't mean much unless they see action." Alan nodded slowly, as though digesting that. "Do you think you can reach them?" "I already have," she said quietly. "Now the question is whether the school can meet them halfway." She didn't say it as a challenge, but she knew he heard it that way, and she didn't mind. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but in the weeks that followed, Monica began to notice subtle changes, not just in the group she met with every week, but in the halls, in the classrooms, in the way a few of the teachers began to carry themselves. It was as if a quiet current had started to flow through the school, pulling people toward a different way of thinking. Her students, the ones Alan had called most at risk, had begun showing up earlier to their sessions, sometimes even lingering afterward to talk about things that had nothing to do with grades. She was helping them craft projects that connected history to their own lives, mapping out family stories, tracing how their neighborhoods had changed, asking hard questions about the world they lived in. One afternoon, as she was guiding two students through a community oral history project, Alan stepped into the library. He watched for a while from the corner, unnoticed by the kids, and when they finally left, he approached her with an expression she hadn't seen before, something between humility and disbelief. "I have to admit," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I didn't think it was possible to turn things around this quickly." Monica closed her notebook and looked at him evenly. "This isn't a turnaround yet, Alan. This is a crack in the ice. But if you want it to last, you can't just rely on me coming in once a week and talking to a handful of kids. You have to change the way this place works." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the door as though he could see the whole building at once. "You're right. And I should have listened to you years ago. I told myself it was about the culture of the school, but the truth is, it was about my own blind spots." It was the closest thing to an apology she'd heard from him, and for a moment, she considered letting it pass without comment. But then she thought about the young woman she'd been, sitting in his office, hearing him say she didn't fit in, and she knew this moment mattered. "You cost me years here," she said, her tone steady, not accusatory. "But you also gave me a chance to prove that what I said back then was right. This school can't succeed by forcing people to fit in. It succeeds by letting them be seen." Alan met her eyes, and for once, he didn't look away. "If you'd be willing to stay longer, not just as a consultant, but to lead a new community program, I'd do whatever it takes to make it happen." Monica didn't answer immediately. She thought of the students who had started to open up, the walls that had begun to crack, and the possibility of building something lasting here. She also thought about the cost, the long hours, the uphill battles, the bureaucracy that never went away. Finally, she smiled faintly. "We'll talk about it. But if I stay, it'll be on my terms. And this time, I won't be the one who has to change to fit in." When she left that day, she walked down the steps of Roosevelt High with the same purpose she'd had years ago, but now, it was sharpened by the knowledge that she didn't need the school's approval to do the work she was meant to do. The leaves in the courtyard swirled in the wind as the students streamed past her, some nodding in recognition, others still too shy to meet her eyes. She knew there was more work ahead, but she also knew this. Change had begun, and this time, it would have roots.